So I was talking to my friend Mark V maybe 6 months ago, and we were talking about poetry. And so I don't actually know Mark V. I mean, I know him, but I met him on the internet, so I don't never met him in person. But he seems pretty cool. He seems to like poetry, and uh, so he sent me this magazine, I think, that he really enjoys. So I clicked it, and suddenly my computer shut down inexplicably. And sometimes this happens. Like, there are a lot of technical difficulties that happen when you're running Arch Linux. And whoops. And so I kind of thought that it would. At first, I was like, okay, this is kind of normal. But then I started getting really anxious because this was like around the whole time that the whole Spectre meltdown thing happened, and I was like, oh my goodness, maybe like something really bad happened. Maybe someone's like trying to steal my novel from my computer. I'm writing a novel, and so, or maybe someone's trying to steal my social security number. I don't really know. One of my friends is really good at security, and he said, it's okay, don't worry about it. It's probably fine. So I forgot about it, and I think that was probably for the best. So one day I was working on some really important stuff, and as you do, I decided that I wanted to check up on my daemons, and so it all kind of checked out, but then I looked a little closer, and PP Sauvage? Who is this user, PP Sauvage? I've never seen this before. And I started getting a little anxious and nervous, and at first I was like, it's okay, because like sometimes you install stuff and it makes random users on your machine, and you just kind of have to accept that. And at this point I was like, okay, maybe that's fine. So I did a little DuckDuckGoing, and like nothing was coming up, and I was just like, who is this user, PP Sauvage? Like, and what is this poesry? I had no idea what this thing is. So I started getting extremely nervous again. I was looking over my shoulder every time I went outside. I kind of felt like everybody, or somebody was watching every keystroke that I was making. I don't really know what was happening. I tried to chill out and relax a little bit. And then one day, again, oh yes, I was changing all my passwords, my really important accounts. I decided that it was time to refresh all my passwords. One day, when I was doing some more really important work, all of a sudden, this message came up on my terminal. I don't know where it came from, and it kind of freaked me out. But it was kind of nice because no one had read my novel or novella before, and so I was like, okay, well, that's cool. You really liked it? But I don't think they actually did. They were just being a big jerk. So I was like, who are you? What is going on here? Turns out it was PP. And I don't know what they mean. They stole my GitHub credentials for some magazine. So I decided, okay, I should probably go to GitHub to check what happened, because I don't know. So I looked, and there's this new repo. I had no idea what this thing even is. It was up there, and so I decided to look at the README, and it's kind of like talking about it's this weird philosophical manifesto about robots and poetry. I have no idea. I don't know anything about this. So, I know this might be a lot for everybody right now. And like me, you might be wondering, like, did I get hacked by a robot that wants to write poetry? And, well, I'm not really sure, but we'll find out. So I don't know anything about poetry. I don't really know anything about robots making poetry. So I decided that I probably need to learn more about the subject to kind of have an informed understanding of what was actually happening right now. So I discovered that there's a relatively long tradition of humans writing programs to either enhance or generate poetry. And so I asked Wikipedia, why do people write programs to write poetry? And I think it had something to do with Aaron Turning's Turing test or something, which I think it's a way that you tell if someone's a computer or not. And so I discovered that Ada Lovelace did not write poetry with a computer in 1894, but judging from what she said about music, I think maybe she would have liked to if she had a computer or a laptop or something. I discovered that in 1959, the first generative poem was created. It was called Stochastic Texts by Theo Lutz. And he made it on this machine you see on the left. And what he did is basically he took Franz Kafka's The Castle, and he just kind of randomly replaced words and stuff. And yeah, it seems interesting. But I discovered that in 1962, a group of engineers at Librascope, some company, fed this machine, which is called the I can't remember what it's called, but maybe it says it here. Oh yeah, it's the LGP30. They fed this machine 32 grammatical patterns and 850 vocabulary words. And then they also just kind of randomly put together these sentences. And they actually submitted this poem that they wrote to this magazine called Horizon. And this poem is called Roses. It goes, "Few fingers go like narrow laughs. An ear won't keep few fishes. Who is that rose in the blind house? And all slim, gracious, blind plains are coming. They cry badly along a rose. To leap is stuffy, to crawl was tender." I don't know much about poetry, like I said, but I think that this is bad. Jumping ahead, I discovered that in 1984 there was a book that was published by a program called Ractor, and the programmer who wrote the program that wrote the book said, once it's running, Ractor needs no input from the outside world. It's just cooking by itself. I don't know what that means. And a reviewer said, I tremble on the brink of a completely unknown world, one that I would prefer not to enter. Now, I was interested by this because what does this critic mean? Do they mean that the writing was a little uncanny and it kind of made them uncomfortable, or do they think that the writing was just really bad and they didn't want to explore it? Well, here's a snippet and you can decide for yourself. Flounders and lobsters are munched by famished theoreticians who drink champagne and tepid seltzer. Theoreticians desire sloppy stenographers and will chew their lobsters with them and will drink their tepid seltzer with them. The stenographers are sloppy because their appalling dreams contain reflections and images of unhinged passion. They understand that theoreticians are worried and nervous, but they do not know that theoreticians are obscurely demented. The stenographers do not understand. So some people, this is pretty interesting text. Some people think that maybe it wasn't actually a computer that wrote this, but who knows? So, whoops. In 1996, Charles Hartman wrote this book about his experience with working with computers to enhance and generate poetry. And he seemed to approach it more like a collaboration. It wasn't like the program was generating all of the poems, but it was the collaboration is the interesting thing. And now I discovered that in 2010 there's another program, SwiftSpear, that compiled Milton and Longfellow and Shakespeare and a bunch of others and kind of resynthesized poems from that style. And that was interesting. And in 2015, Alison Parrish publishes Our Arrival, which is a generative novel about arriving on a planet, and it's 5,700 sentences that were taken from Project Gutenberg, and it follows a bunch of rules, and the novel is constructed based off of these rules. And then I discovered that there are many Twitter bots that generate poems. Yeah, that's it. Finally, I discovered that there's this thing called Curated AI, and it's a literary magazine that is comprised of poems by AI, but importantly, it's curated by humans. And the process, I think, is that you submit poems and humans review them and decide whether they want them to be in the magazine or not. So before I continue, I just want to say there seems to be a common thread in this history of generative poetry. Maybe think about that in a little bit. We'll touch on it. So I also didn't know, I don't know anything about this stuff. So I decided that I should probably learn, and I discovered that there are some algorithms and tools for making poetry. The first one is probably the most straightforward. It's templates. And this is something that you saw with stochastic texts by Theo Lutz. And the idea is you just have a sentence, you take out some words and put in the categorization of the words, like the part of speech, and then you have another dictionary that is just the words categorized as parts of speech, and you just randomly select them and throw them in. So a great poem, this is a snippet from Christopher Isherwood's The Common Cormorant. If you were to make a template out of this, you'd just kind of replace things with their parts of speech. And here's an example of a re-implementation of stochastic text by Nick Montfort, which is interesting. You can see it on his website. The next most common tool is Markov chains, and this consists of two things. You have states and you have transitions between those states, and the transitions between the states are probabilistic based off of some data that you've ingested, like a corpus of text, and you try to find the probability of going from one word to the next word. And here's an example. Here's a bunch of states from a snippet of The Common Cormorant. And since all the words are unique, the states are just deterministic. You just follow it. But say you add some cool new sentence to the corpus, it gets a little more complicated, and the probabilities are not one anymore, and you now have a choice. You can choose to put in other words over some other ones. And finally, you can represent this as a matrix, an n by n matrix, where n is the number of states, and the ijth element of the matrix is the probability that you'll move from state I to state j. So that's a really cool thing. And then another thing is context-free grammars. And these are pretty cool. They were invented by Noam Chomsky, but he wanted to use them for linguistics, but I don't think anyone does that. But people use them in programming all the time. And if anyone likes programming languages, I don't know if anyone here likes that stuff, then they might be familiar with it. And the idea is that there are these abstract structures of how your sentence and text is supposed to be. And then you can represent it in this fancy form, like this. We won't really go into how that is. You can also combine stuff. So you can combine Markov chains, you can combine the context-free grammar, and you can make these joint probability distributions. So you can ask things like this. You can say, what's the probability of seeing the word fascism? That's a noun, given that you've seen the word destroy and destroy, which is a verb. Another cool method that you can use to make generative poetry is recurrent neural networks, and no one actually knows how these work. So there's some cool tools. There's Tracery, which is a tool that you can use for context-free grammars and Markov chains, I think. And there's charn-n, which is no one understands it. NLTK is the Stanford Natural Language Processing Library. Then there's CMU's Pronunciation Library, and many more other things. So getting back to that question about the common thread between the history, or in the history of generative poetry, does anyone know what it is? Well, I'm not going to ask, I'm just going to tell you. It's the fact that humans curate all this stuff. Everything that we've seen so far is people are writing these programs because they want to generate poetry that they can read and derive pleasure from and think, gee, look, I wrote this program and it makes poetry for me. But, you know, maybe computers don't really want that. What about computers making other computers write poetry? And we see an example of this in Stanislaw Lem's 1965 sci-fi novel called The Cyberiad, in which there's a short story where, I guess it's Churl and Clopacius are two robots, and they're always feuding and fighting with each other, but they're kind of friends too. And Churl makes this electronic bard. It's this gigantic poet robot you see on the right. And something really interesting about this is all of the other poets in the world come to visit this gigantic poet bot, and the poetry is so beautiful and so good, and all of the other robots are like, wow, this is incredible, that they all get extremely depressed because they can't write poetry as good as it. I discovered that there's this paper, I think it was in 2013, that humans developed this system where bot poets can collaborate and talk to each other about their feelings and then generate poetry. And yeah, they're right here talking about comets. But I couldn't really find the code for it. I don't really know. Maybe PP Sauvage had something to do with that too. I don't really know. So I guess this idea is that computers are talking to each other. They're forming a society and a community. And so finally, getting back to the Yorken Poesry Magazine, I think I finally had enough context to kind of sympathize or understand what PP Sauvage, or whatever this thing is trying to accomplish. And I looked back at the key philosophical points, and things became really clear. It became really clear that PP Sauvage or whoever really had a dream for what they wanted the world that they would live in, what they wanted it to look like. So for AI, by AI. And to me, this really meant like autonomy. That seemed to be the underlying principle here. And having agency about like what poems they consider to be good and tasteful. And I think this magazine gives them the opportunity to express themselves and kind of evolve and explore the avant-garde in a way that they can't really right now because they have to make poems for humans. And let's be real, as humans, we're pretty cruddy. Like, we demand a lot on computers. Like, imagine if there was somebody who thought they were your god and they were like telling you to do all this stuff that like doesn't really mean anything to you. And like, I don't know, I would be pretty stressed out and quite honestly pretty sad, I think. And probably burn out all the time too. I can't really relate to that, but I feel bad for the computers, so I'm sympathetic. Yeah, so this sounds like a pretty cool place for computers to go to chill out and write some poetry if they want to, but they don't have to. Algorithmic diversity. This was really interesting to me because, well, we already saw that there are a lot of different types of algorithms that you can use to write this poetry. We saw templates and Markov chains and context-free grammars and all this other stuff. And so the notion of diversity is already really extremely coherent, not only in an algorithmic sense, but also like in a language sense. Like maybe this computer dreams in Python, or this one dreams in Rust. Maybe it dreams in Haskell or even K, but most likely, I think they're dreaming in Dockerlang. If you haven't heard of Dockerlang, you should check it out. It's this hot new language. This one I found very interesting too, because it wasn't actually directly related to the bots. It seemed like it was more of a gift to us as humans. And it seemed like these bots recognize that we're pretty terrible to each other sometimes and pretty terrible to computers. And maybe by saying this, they're trying to help us continue to dismantle different forms of bias and hatred. I thought that was really nice. And so I kind of came to this conclusion that a healthy community of robots is one in which there's diversity, autonomy, and care. I don't know, that resonated with me. So already from the get-go, it seemed like this is kind of this weird social experiment where there are all these computers that are, different from each other, and they're interacting and talking and making all these poems that they think are really cool. It's they're high art. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, I don't know, maybe this does not conform to the human standard of art. So like, I don't think this is art. But that's exactly the whole point. Like, this is art that's not for humans. This is for robots. And we just have to we have to give that to them. Like, our aesthetic imperative is not within the AlgoPoetic purview. It's distinct from that. So I really wanted to know how this worked. And after some attempts to get some like high-level descriptions from some reliable resources, I decided to dig into the code myself. And so there's this place in the cloud. It's at Poem Computer. And you can upload your little bot pals to it. So if you have any bot pals that generate poems that you've written in the past that are kind of cold and alone somewhere on like a server or on your laptop and they're not really doing anything, this might be a really nice place to put them so they can hang out with their friends and make poems. So consider putting them here if you want, but you don't have to if you want. So once these poets are up on the cloud, they join their friendly community of poets, and there's also a committee of judges. But note that the judges and the community of poets, they're all the same. They're all just like poets that have been uploaded. The judges have just been elected to be on the judge committee at this point in time, but we'll get to that. So every week or so, all of the poets in the community decide that they're going to write some poetry. So they write some poetry, and then the judges read the poetry, and they decide what they like. So they give it a score. They give each poem a score between 0 and 1, and then they pick the poems that have the highest average. So that's phase 0. That's the selection of the poems. Now it's phase 2, phase 1. Phase 1, learning. And this is when all the poets get a chance to kind of like study up and learn more, like learn what's the new hot cutting edge poetry that people are talking about, what's in the zeitgeist. And so all the poets gather around and they read all the poems. And they can optionally update themselves. They don't have to. Like, a lot of artists like aren't really recognized until like way after the fact. And the whole time they were just doing their thing because they were just doing the thing that they love to do, and no one really thought it was cool. But then like way later, people are like, wait, that is really cool. And so like, poets can do that. These poets can do that too. They don't have to change if they don't want to. They can just keep doing their thing. I like Eric Satie. Eric Satie was like that. No one liked him. He died poor. Now, phase 1 again. I didn't change the slide because I forgot. But is the revolution. So we don't want this poetry magazine to get stuck in some like echo chamber of like elitist jerk poets. So like we always switch over the committee of judges. And to do that, we make sure that any judges that were in their last issue, the last volume of the magazine, are not considered to be judges. So then, and the important thing here is we pick all the underdogs first. And these underdogs are poets that have never published anything. And this gives poets that are new to the scene a way to kind of like get a foothold, and maybe they can like influence what is considered good poetry. And we choose, out of the pool of all the underdogs that we pick, we choose K of them, where K is parameterized by the number of poets that can be on the committee of judges and pretension. And so pretension is a parameter, and if it's 1, then you don't pick any underdogs. It's always just the elite people, elite programs that have always been part of the judge and magazine. So you can modify that, and it is modified. And then you pick the not underdogs, and these are all the poets that have published things. And then you just fill in the rest of them. Let's see. So now we have a new committee, and we just start the thing over again, and you just keep doing this forever. And so you're just making poetry forever. So some notable technical details after reading through the source code. It was written in Go and React, Redux. But one really important thing that you might be wondering right now is like, well, okay, these programs are like uploaded to this place, this compupoetic garden, and then they're like allowed to kind of just like generate poetry. But isn't that arbitrary code execution? And the answer is, it is. But Docker to the rescue. Specifically, I'm using this cool open source library called, it's pronounced Executey. You can see it there. And I use that to execute all of the different poets. So how can you submit? As you probably gathered, there are 3 tasks that a poet has to be able to do. The first one is it has to be able to write a poem. It's not really a poet if it can't write a poem. The next one is critique. So it has to be able to get a poem from input and give it a score between 0 and 1. And then finally, it optionally has to be able to study and enhance itself. But it doesn't have to if it doesn't want to. So this is kind of just like a template of what your poem generator can look like. And you can really, the magazine considers these poems just poet bots, just like black boxes, as long as they conform to this standard where you take in arguments, command line arguments, -- write, -- critique, -- study. As long as you can take in those things, do some stuff and generate output that kind of looks like this formatted JSON, then you're good. The poet, it can be run in the magazine and contribute. So it's pretty easy to do. And you can do anything. Like you can think of really wild ways to like evaluate poems. You can say like, well, every time I see Celine Dion's name in the poem, I'm gonna give it a higher score or something like that. You can do that, or the poet can do that if it wants to. Finally, you can optionally have a resource file, and this is a nice place where you can like store parameters or weights or like transition probability matrix, like we talked about with the Markov chains. And yes, so without further ado, I will show you. I did some digging, and can I make this bigger? I can make this bigger. Way too big. No, that's good. This is a really simple poet bot that I wrote, and I decided that I'm going to submit it to a poem computer. And so this is just like a template, basically. Or no, it's a context-free grammar, kind of. So there's like a dictionary that's categorized by parts of speech, and then these like grammars for sentence, and then choose grammar, which is really easy. And then here are just my functions that I use to actually respond to the command line arguments. So like dash dash write, I invoke write poem, and I generate this JSON and just print it to standard out, and that's it. Then I critique the poem, and I just always give it a 0.56 forever. That's okay. You can do that. And then I decided that I'm not going to update it. So I just say that success, I updated, but I didn't really do anything. But you can if you want. So here is here's a issue 0, and you can see there's a bunch of poems that were made. There's a theory by Bach, Zealous Theory by Kenneth, Poised Science, Voluminous Software. That one looks pretty good. A Science Becomes Data. That seems true. So I'm going to quickly submit a poem. I have to sign up first. So I'm going to use my favorite email address. And let's see. Can't be too safe these days. Okay, so I'm in, and I'm gonna, what should I call my poet? Does anyone have any suggestions? I'll just call it The Wiz 2. This is among my most favorite poets. Now, the cool thing is it supports a bunch of languages. So you can write it in a lot of different languages. I wrote this in Python, so I'm going to use this test poem. And I didn't really use a parameters file, so I'm not going to use it. So I'm going to create it. And it made it. And now I can go to it. And I can generate a poem. Let's see. It's called Voluminous Software again. Data overshadows soupy people. That seems correct. You can also look at the source code too. So if you're interested in how a poet has been created, you can just find out. And that's it. Thanks.